Okay, so welcome everyone to the second installment of our great debates and controversies of Jewish history. I also want to acknowledge my good friend Rabbi Grover, who's joined us. He was a very, very gracious, continues to be gracious, but from the moment I met him, he's been very, very kind to me, so I appreciate that he's with us today. So we're going to cover the topic for tonight, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, the struggle for the soul of modern Jewry. If you like the title, I didn't write it. I stole it from Samuel Friedman, whose book, Jew versus Jew, was one of the books that I utilized in researching this topic. It's a wonderful book. If you want to know more about it, I highly recommend it. It's a really great... he does it sort of like an investigative interview, investigative journalist and interview style, but he's very factual as well, and he gives a great picture of, I would say, specifically the American scene, but the 20th century. We're going to do something very ambitious tonight. We're going to cover around, 200 years or so. I'm just going to cover some flashpoints, some highlights of those years, and hopefully gain some insight into what I think we would all agree after we finish. Maybe we'll have some disagree, but that's always exciting. That all these three movements that are mentioned in the title, the subtitle, are modern movements, and we'll see soon why I say that. But we'll understand that that all these three movements are modern movements and tell a greater story about the confrontation between modernity and tradition. So, just by way of introduction, I like always to tell you most of the sources, if not all of them, where I'm coming from. If you could take a look at the source materials, I'm not going to go list all of them right now. But I'm not just making this up out of thin air, so you could take a look and see for yourself. And if you want to know more information, I can give you more source material. A friend of mine, Yehuda Geberer, who also has a fantastic podcast, I'll recommend his podcast for anyone who likes Jewish history. It's called Jewish History Soundbites. So Yehuda Geberer actually is a friend of mine going back to yeshiva in the Mir. And he has a series that he's now doing currently, a fantastic series called The Secularization of the Jewish People. And in this series, he says he's researched this for many, many years. I've just spent about a month on this topic. But he has researched this for many years. He's an historian, he's a tour guide, he's a very well-read and informed person. And he makes the following point, which I think is important to say at the outset. If we make the assumption that around the year 1700, approximately, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people, let's just say, I'm not going to be specific in numbers, but around 90%, let's just say, were traditionally observant in the we call it the traditional definition. Shabbos, kosher, keeping the regular traditional forms of observance. And if we go fast forward, to 2025, you don't have to be a demographic scientist. You look around, and I would say that the number has reversed to about 90%, if not more, of the Jewish community is not observant, is secular, and is not, again, traditionally observant. People could be religious in different ways, but the general same religious observance definition. And the question is why? Now, most will say, at least at some point in their education, if they have a Jewish education, they were told, or especially if they were in an Orthodox educational institution, the narrative is that basically beginning with Moses Mendelssohn, which we'll discuss, but the fact that there was reform even before him is usually not addressed. But starting with Moses Mendelssohn and really, exploding in Berlin, there were these new movements that promulgated different ideologies. They were so successful that they spread around the entire world. And as a result of these, let's call them accommodations to modernity on these different, ways that we change tradition to try to match and to assimilate into the world, that caused secularization. That's the narrative that's sort of often used, and these, internal, I would say, Jewish factions and movements are often blamed for the cause of this secularization. Geberer argues, I think very, very strongly, and we're not going to go into all his proofs, but very, very compelling argument, that this is not the case. The cause of the secularization of the Jewish people is something that is nothing to do with internal factors, nothing to do with different movements, accommodations, or anything of the like. It has to do with the world. The world changed. Modernity, and the Industrial Revolution, globalization, immigration, the whole idea of the different political movements, revolutions, wars, displacement, oppression, all these things caused a global, you could see this across different religious communities, not just a Jewish story. This is the story of the modern era. And the world shifted in the last 300 or so years from a world that was primarily sort of, internal, and everyone lived in a certain area and they followed certain norms. And then you have this huge revolution, the Industrial Revolution. You have ability to travel, the ability to make to emancipation. You could become part of the Jewish people. The door was open to society. It has nothing to do with the internal ideologies or movements that began. So that's sort of just as a beginning, and we'll probably return back to this point. But it really tells a greater story about modernity more than the battles between the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. But it's important to understand that Orthodoxy's confrontation with these new movements, and we're going to deal with a lot of that, really was its defining moment. In other words, when I said Orthodoxy is also a modern movement, I don't mean to say that people didn't keep Torah and mitzvos. There was no revelation, chas v'shalom. There was definitely a traditional idea of what a Jew meant, but being an Orthodox Jew was by definition a response to modernity. And by saying, we're going to draw the line, we're not going to be them. We're not going to accept accommodation. We're not going to be open-minded to fill in the blank. That, by definition, is a response to modernity, and that was Orthodoxy's ticket to success, because as we see, Orthodoxy really flourished by defining itself and giving its own identity by confronting and sometimes labeling as other movements. And that really was one of the really strengthened the Orthodox movement, which was its response to the non-Orthodox and the Reform and the Conservative. So let's begin, even though, as I mentioned, it's not really necessarily the most natural beginning, but you have to begin somewhere. So we're going to begin with Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn is born in Dessau, Germany in 1729. He was a child prodigy. He was, developed a interest in medieval philosophy. I'm now citing from Jacob J. Schachter, Rabbi J.J. Schachter's PhD dissertation on Rabbi Yaakov Emden, 1988. So he gives a little introduction to this correspondence, which we're going to deal with between Emden and Mendelssohn. But he first describes Mendelssohn. So Mendelssohn was this brilliant youngster. As a child, he studied traditional Jewish texts and Jewish medieval philosophy, and at some point got interested into other secular philosophy. And fascinating, in 1763, he received great recognition as one of the leading writers and philosophers in Germany when he was awarded first place in an essay competition of the Berlin Royal Academy, besting, who later became more well-known, besting the philosopher Immanuel Kant. So he bested Kant in a philosophical competition in 1763. So there's a lot to discuss about Mendelssohn and the rabbinic reaction to him, but I'm going to start with a correspondence that he has with Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was born in 1697 and died in 1776, was a very important leading traditional rabbi, open-minded German rabbi. And for about 7 years, he has a fascinating correspondence with Moses Mendelssohn. One of the things Mendelssohn writes to him about, he's very bothered by the Rambam's definition of the Chasidi Umos Ha'olam, those non-Jews who have a share in the world to come. And he's upset because the Rambam says that you have to accept the 7 Noahide laws because they were commanded by God at Sinai, and he says if it's just because of moral reasons or wisdom, you don't qualify. And Mendelssohn was very bothered by this, and he writes to Emden, and they have these long correspondences back and forth. But they disagreed about something, and this, according to Dr. Mark Shapiro, this is possibly the first modern example of a reform that was suggested by Mendelssohn. Does that make him a reformer? Probably not. But he does suggest one reform, and this is when you see this in the correspondence between himself and Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And the story is about, of all things, delaying burial for 3 days. What happened was, basically, according to Jewish law, we have a principle that we bury immediately. It's called, you're not allowed to leave a person, a dead body, unburied, and it's called Baal Talin or Halanas Hames. You're not allowed to leave over a dead body. And that's why there are exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, that's why we bury immediately, if at all possible. Now, it seems to be, I don't know the medical history over here, but it seems to be that this became challenged by medical knowledge at the time, and people were worried that they were possibly burying people alive. And therefore, it became either it was there's like these stories about people having bells or holding a mirror to the person to see if they were breathing. All this discussion was occurring that maybe you're not accounting for the fact that maybe the person fainted, maybe they're not really dead, and you're burying someone alive. I can't verify whether that is true or not true. In other words, if that really was an issue, but this was definitely being discussed. And we know that this is being discussed because we have records of the following law. In 1772, by the way, this is all in Schachter's, I'm just not reading all of it inside, but you could take a look in the sources. This is all in Schachter's dissertation, Rabbi J.J. Schachter. So in 1772, the Duke of Mecklenburg, which is a small district in Germany, issues a law, which obviously impacted the Jewish community, that you may not bury someone who died before waiting 3 days. And there is discussion about how he was influenced by also not just the medical professionals, but also there was a Jewish apostate who told him that this is all based on Kabbalah. Not for now. So the Jewish community was obviously very shocked and very, unsure what to do. So they turned to two different individuals. One was Moses Mendelssohn, and the other was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. And they wrote to these leaders of the community, respected. This is how you see that Mendelssohn wasn't this, total reformer the way that people explain. He was turned to by a traditional Jewish community. Obviously, he was well respected in the general society, so that made sense to speak to him. But obviously, they had a certain trust in his understanding, and they wrote to both of them. Now, I'm just debating with myself how much to read inside, but we'll see a little bit of the correspondence. So they write to both of them. As you could predict, as I've painted the picture, Mendelssohn was much more ready to accommodate, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, absolutely not. This is a prohibition, we cannot budge. And then Mendelssohn and Emden have a correspondence, and it actually is a few letters back and forth. We don't have all the letters, but we have enough to put together a basic picture of what happened. So, first of all, you could take a look at some of the respect that they had for each other, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he refers to him, you could take a look in source number 2, he refers to Mendelssohn earlier, I'm going back a little bit, but earlier in the correspondence over those 7 years, he refers to him as a charming man, ish chamudos, masterful religious philosopher. He refers to him almost like as a son. He's illumined the eyes of the blind and awakened the hearts of the righteous. That was in the previous correspondence. Now, in 1772, Mendelssohn advocating that medical authorities. I'm just reading from source number 3 here. Medical authorities will also testify and state that occasionally the pulse will cease, the heart will rest, and breathing will stop for a short while without total and complete death. That it is impossible to clarify the difference between fainting and death. And then he tries to bring a proof from a Mishnah in Maseches Smachos, without getting into all the details, that there were cases where he wanted to argue that actually the tradition was they left them unburied for a long time, so why are we not going back to that tradition? Fine. So he's basically arguing to allow for this halanas hames, to let the body go unburied for three days. And Rabbi Emden responds and rejects all of Mendelssohn's arguments, and very forcefully, which possibly Mendelssohn did not expect from all of their other correspondences that were very cordial and respectful. Just going to read this is in translation here. It was a highly charged and emotional response. He writes as follows: Heaven forfend! It is profane to question the custom of our fathers who are scattered in the four corners of the earth, in spite of all the variations in their customs in areas that do not really matter that much. In this regard, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and those from the east and west are identical. It was neither known or heard in the entire world in those places where our fellow co-religionists are scattered that they should practice another custom in the burial of their dead other than which we practice in these countries. Chas v'shalom, right? Heaven forfend, chalila v'chas, to entertain in our minds the possibility that that we should have erred. And he basically says to him, Im ein neviim heim, b'nei neviim heim. The Jewish people are not prophets, but they're the sons of prophets, and their practice is sacrosanct, and we can't change it. And he says, my son, it must be that you made a mistake. I can't imagine that you would think that we should change, like a little bit, patronizing him a little bit, and going to be overlook a biblical prohibition like lo talin. How could it be? Must have been an error. We don't have the next letter that Mendelssohn writes back, but apparently he tries to push again, because you can see from Rabbi Emden's response, he goes even harsher, and he says, I don't know why you're so upset with me. I don't know why you're so offended. What wrong have I done to you? What hardship have I caused you? And he writes, since I sense in this second letter that it is difficult for you to bow your head, to admit the truth, it would have been proper for me not to bother with you anymore in this matter. For all my words are good, correct, and right to those who have attained knowledge. And he basically accuses him of changing tradition to basically conform with the medical advice here, and that he's not admitting to his mistake. So that's an important debate here, and is probably the first major reform that was suggested in the modern era. But it appears that they did not follow this din that Mendelssohn is suggesting. But it shows you a little bit about the relationship and the response to Mendelssohn. Another thing to point out is that Mendelssohn, along with other writers, composed a new parish, a new commentary on the Torah, and that was called Nesivos Shalom, or as others refer to it as the Bior, the parish on the Torah. And when he was completed in 1783, it had a number of different authors. The most famous, co-author of the work was Naftali Hertz Wesley, who is actually quoted by a number of different Mefarshim. Interestingly enough, it seems to be that some had more positive things to say about these authors than others. The Netziv quotes him, I believe. Rav Hirsch definitely quotes him. But at some point, the translation was criticized by many of the Rabbanim, and it was considered to be a breach from the norm. It was a translation into German, and that was written in the Hebrew lettering, but it was a translation into German, which was not been done, and was seen as a very major breach in traditional community. As you'll notice, a lot of these battle points and these fault lines that were drawn today, they're not necessarily issues. So we'll have to discuss some of that also. There is interestingly enough, there's something going around on the internet and other places that I found a haskama. Yeah, sure. I found a haskama that Rabbi Akiva Eger wrote to a work in 1832, and the work included the Be'er of Reish Mem ben Mem Nun, which is Rabbi Moshe, I think Mendelssohn, or Moshe ben Mendel. So that is interesting that Rabbi Akiva Eger would write in Haskama. But if you look at the Haskama, first of all, he barely even mentions Mendelssohn. It's mostly about the Heinemann, Yirmiyahu Heinemann, and his work, and it's not very. It's pretty pariv. It doesn't really speak anything about Mendelssohn. He sort of says, I don't really write Haskamos. It's really important to read the Haskamos. Sometimes you see a book with a lot of approbations, but you don't actually read the words, and sometimes the words say, I don't really know what this guy's asking me, but I think he's a nice person, but it's in Hebrew and has the rabbi's insignia on. It's like, whoa, there's a Haskama here. I remember one time I was in Sfas for Shabbos. My stepfather is a Breslover Chassid, the real deal. Like, I'm not anti-Breslov at all. I think it's an amazing Chassidus, but there's some crazies out there. So I remember I went to somebody's house, and there was this book, and he was telling me about this petek that fell down from Shemayim, and all these things, and how it's a new nevuah, and Nachma Mu'uman is the Shir Chadash that's going to come, and Mashiach's going to say it. And I was like, okay, that's great. It was very nice. He was hosting me in his house. He was a brother of my friend or something like that. So, okay. And then he pulls off the shelf this book by this rabbi, I forgot what his name was already, but this Nanach person, and it has, boom, right there, Haskama for Moshe Feinstein on the front of. I almost fell on the floor. I was like, are you kidding me? Moshe Feinstein is. So I later on discovered that Moshe Feinstein said, give this person money. He's trying to make a partner. You have to read the Haskamas. Yes, Lesher, you had a question. I agree with you. I think it's hard to argue. Yes. We're going to get to the Chasam Sofer's response. Yes. I agree with you. I don't think this is the fault line. Maybe I should have been more clear. I think this is an example of an earlier debate between two different approaches, it seems to be, to the questions that were being, like the conflicts between modern medicine and traditionalism. But I don't think that there really was there was no reform movement. There was no movement that supported Halanas HaMeis, and that was therefore, emerged and matured into the reform movement. Absolutely not. It's just probably an early example of a reform that was suggested, and you see such a strong backlash from Rabbi Emden, and you just see how these issues, are already sort of boiling underneath the surface. But I agree with you. I don't think that this is the landmark fault line that's drawn. We'll see a lot more of that in the Chasam Sofer, the Ezra Hashem. Yes. He totally disregards medical opinion. He says you shouldn't listen to them. It's so far-fetched. It could be he had doctors who he spoke with, but he doesn't mention them in the response. He says it's complete nonsense. He says there's no way you're burying someone alive. It's so outlandish. It's so ridiculous. But I don't know if he spoke with doctors or he just was using his common sense. But there was a law that was passed, so it's hard to understand. Again, like I said, I don't really know what was happening then. I don't have the medical records, but clearly there was a concern. And Rabbi Emden saying it's totally not a concern. I don't really know what to make of that. It does seem a little crazy they would bury people alive, but it seems like that was an issue that they were worried about.
It was a common phenomenon that, first of all, they had bells over.
They had the bells, yeah.
And also, when they opened caskets, they found scratch marks on the top of the casket. So burying people alive.
So it did happen sometimes.
It did happen, 100%.
Right. It's possible. The question is how far do you have to go for such a concern? But yes. Okay. Just looking at the time. So let's do one more rabbinic response to Mendelssohn, and that was a very, very strong response from Rabbi Moshe Sofer. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, known as the Chasam Sofer, so he was known to be really a public enemy of Moses Mendelssohn. What's interesting is that he had at his funeral, this is from an article written by Schneer Lyman, source number 5, at his funeral he had, I guess it was his wish, that they read aloud his will and last will and testament, and one of the things that he writes in this will that was read at his funeral was Ubesifre Ramad al Tishluchu Yad. Do not take up, cast away the books of Rev Moshe Midesau. Reish Mem Dalet is Rev Moshe Midesau. Now, the Chasam Sofer was such a larger than life personality that all the movements, the Haskalah, the Reform, they all really wanted to have Reb Moshe Sofer on their side. So how did they deal with this? He clearly said explicitly that they shouldn't learn any of the works of Mendelssohn. So later on, the Maskilim claimed that the text actually was not Ramad, but rather Ches Mem Daled, which is like Sifrei Chemed, which is like romantic novels and things like that. It's obviously not true. He was a very strong opponent of the Chasam Sofer. What's very interesting is in this article from Tradition, 1989, Dr. Schneur Lyman points out that there's a correspondence between Rav Moshe Schick, also known as the Maram Schick, and Rabbi Hillel Lichtenstein. And Rav Maram Schick was a great disciple of the Chasam Sofer. And there's a fascinating correspondence that they have when he's asked, Rav Hillel Lichtenstein asks him, is it true that what people say that the Chasam Sofer took Mendelssohn's biur and threw it on the ground? Is that really true? So he says, I don't believe that that's the case. I never saw that happen. Maybe you're thinking of something else. And he tells him the following story. He says, one time the Chasam Sofer was visiting us in our community, and he would speak in the shul, and I spoke, and the minhag that he had, the practice he had, was he didn't want to read or darshan and say psukim without looking at a chumash. So he was asking this Maram Schick, he was asking him if he had any chumashim to use for the drasha. So apparently he was in his home, and at the time he had 3 editions of the Torah. One was in the shul, the other was in the shul for his wife, and the other one at home was the Be'er, was Mendelssohn's Be'er, and he didn't really want to tell the Chasam Sofer that he had Mendelssohn's Be'er in his house. So he said he didn't have one. So he was then, wherever the Chasam Sofer was staying, he told his host, I don't understand, the rabbi doesn't have a chumash, it's so crazy, he doesn't have a chumash in his house. And apparently the person then, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Turnau, explained to him the story that he had the be'er, but he was embarrassed to tell him. And when he came back during Mincha, he told him, you shouldn't have that anymore. And he told him, what do you mean? There was a righteous Jew who learned from the be'er, and he says, yes, this well-known Gaon who used it. He says, no, he did not do well in using it, and it's heretical, and you shouldn't touch it, etc. And basically, he tells him, I never heard of him throwing it on the ground, but this is the story. So what you see from this is also similar to our point before. There's strong opposition to Mendelssohn, but there's people reading it. I mean, the Maram Schick. We're not talking about reform here. We're talking about a student of the Chasam Sofer. This other Gaon who's not mentioned, but we know that the Chasam Sofer was very very opposed to it, and others. I'm not going to be. We won't have time to go into all of it. But Rev Yecheskel Landau, the Nod of Yehuda, I have over here a letter which is questioned by some to be accurate, but a letter that he wrote to someone calling him a min and a kofar, apikoris, all these different things. What's very interesting is, in the course of me studying, looking into this, researching this, I found an article printed in a Reform journal, which quotes from a Sefer Kovetz Beis Aaron v'Yisrael, which is a stolen Karlin Torah journal. So you have a Reform publication quoting a Hasidic journal. I just think that's just a fast for the Nod of Yehuda's letter saying that Mendelssohn was a kofar. I just thought that was very ironic. Apparently, the Hasidim are descendants of the Nod of Yehuda, and therefore they wrote about this. I don't know, but it's a fascinating tidbit. Okay, so just moving on, you could see that letter, which I copied over there for you. It's some question in this letter, but certainly the Nod of Yehuda did not have very kind things to say about Mendelssohn. What happens next, really? So there's sort of this opposition to Mendelssohn. There was no real reform movement as of then, but you have figures like Rav Shamshon Hirsch, Rav Moshe Sofer, as we mentioned before. They start to see, as we mentioned, secularization happening around them, and their response to secularization was to draw certain lines and to say this is out and this is in. And Rav Hirsch, we could really spend a whole series on these two figures alone, but Rav Hirsch is famous for the idea that is ascribed, associated with him, which is called Torah im derech eretz, Torah with sort of a culture, and he saw that people are starting to leave the fold, not understand the depth of Torah, and therefore he responded to that need by saying we can find a Torah framework for this. But again, you see, he uses modern method. He tries to understand culture and Torah and try to find a medium. But that in itself is a form of a reaction to modernity. You could see this in his writings, in his first well-known published writing, the 19 Letters. It's a correspondence between Naphtali and Binyamin. One is a sort of they're both old friends. One has left the religion, and one is this old rabbi, and they're discussing. And you see that he's developing an approach based on sort of the what he sees to be the problems of the community, and arguing that this is the traditional approach, but it's using the modern method, responding to modern problems. As you see, Orthodoxy is a modern movement. Rav Moshe Sofer, it becomes even more clear. So let's talk a little bit about the Chasam Sofer's response, where we really start to see the fault lines drawn. So people use a term that you may have heard before if you learned about this story, HaChadosh Aser Min HaTorah. The Chasam Sofer is known as the one who promulgated a response to modernity by saying, HaChadosh, the new, as Aser Min HaTorah, is forbidden from the Torah, Mikol Makom, B'chol Makom. It's really a reappropriation of a Mishnah in Orla, and he's taking it out of context, and he's saying anything new, it's really a reference to the new grain. Before the second day of Pesach, where we bring the carbon to Omer, the new grain is prohibited. So it's talking about certain cases where, according to one opinion, whether you're in Israel or outside of Israel, b'chol makom, in any case, the new grain is forbidden. But the Chasam Sofer uses this phrase in a few places, that anything new, not just the new grain, but anything new, anything that's an innovation is Aser Min HaTorah, is forbidden from the Torah. Now the thing is, most people soundbite the Chasam Sofer. They just throw this term out there and they start talking about what is his approach, and it's all Chadash Aser Min HaTorah. They don't really read the actual correspondence and the writings of the Chasam Sofer, and they don't know that he has many, many arguments against many of the reforms that were being promulgated during his lifetime. So I don't know if we're going to be able to read all of it inside. I'm just realizing the time is getting late, but we will touch on some of it. So in 1818, the first official Reform synagogue was founded in Hamburg, Germany. But in fact, a little bit earlier, Israel Jacobson, who was this philanthropist, Jewish philanthropist, he introduces changes into the traditional prayer service in Hamburg in 1810. And we will see that the Chasam Sofer was asked about this and responds very, very strongly and goes chapter and verse why he took issue with this. A couple of the things they started to change was they omitted sections from the Siddur. They took out tefillos about the redemption, karbonos, sacrifices, return to Zion. They moved the bima from the middle to the end. Different things that they took out of the prayer service and put an organ in the synagogue for Shabbos. Yes?
And I think it's not only a response to modernity, but it was also a response to Christianity, which might have been starting to get appealing. Not that response to Christianity is new. It's like 2,000 years old.
Right.
But the idea of a choir and an organ and changing
Yes.
Shabbat to a Sunday.
Correct. So this...
There's a certain pressure from Christianity that was new.
Absolutely. So this was a deep influence by this culture around them, and they were more part of that society than they had been before. Right. So it's interesting. The first actual mixed pews seating did not happen in Germany. That's another part of this story is somehow, going back to the original narrative that I told you, like all this goes back to the Reform, and that's where secularization happened. But somehow the Jews in America apparently were able to secularize themselves even without a strong Reform movement. The first mixed pews synagogue was actually in Albany, New York. In Germany, in Berlin, they never dreamed of taking down the Mechitza. It was like these battles, which don't even seem like such, speaking in the vernacular, that was a battle. That was a battle. Like these things, yes, there were people who eventually defected from the community. They baptized, they went to become Christian, but this was a Christian influence, perhaps, but it wasn't yet totally, throwing away religion and secularization. So in response to these issues, the Chasam Sofer writes to the Hamburg Bezdin in 1819 or 1820, in source number 8, he writes, Yikraso higiani. This means like your letter has reached me. Hala'ani alamuni emorim his biani. It's weakened me and shocked me and filled me with bitterness. It's a play on Pasuk and Eicha. Ki magid chadashos. You've informed me these news. Ki yatzu anashim b'nei bli omochos shemayim lahafer brisos b'nachli dasos chadashim mikarov ba'u. That there are these people who do not respect the yoke of heaven, who have come to annul the covenants and make these new religions that have arisen anew. What I numbered some of these issues for you. This is not in the original tshuva, but I numbered some of it. First of all, va'achaz dasam lios based filasam kol yemei hashavua segura umuskeres. That the first is that they're not open the rest of the week. They're only open on Shabbos. Now he has I think this is sarcastic or maybe not sarcastic. He says ubayom haShabbos yiftach. I experimented with a new program which I thought was very cool, which puts nekudos into text. I thought it'd be easier to follow and easier to read, but I don't think it's always accurate. So I'm not sure if this nekudos are actually right. But on Shabbos it's open. He says mi tingam oz v'yiskar delasim. He says halavai they should also lock their doors on Shabbos too. They're only opening on Shabbos. He's like they should lock their doors on Shabbos as well. Then he says that they also are shinu nusachat tefila mukubelos ma'anshei knesses hagadola. They've changed the tefilos that the Anshe Knesset Hagadola established for us and from our Avosino Kedoshim, our holy forefathers. And they start making these nischos, asher badu milibam, that they made up in themselves. And they've then neglected many different brachos. Specifically, he says, I don't want to even mention what they've left out, but they've started to leave out Smichas Karen David Meshichenu, the yearnings for the Davidic Messianic or Davidic dynasty, this Messianic era, and the building of Yerushalayim in the Beis Hamikdash. They've also Yamdu Ne'arim Notzarim. They've then appointed Christian youth that they should be players of the Kinor V'Ugav, the harp and the organ, on Shabbos, which is certainly forbidden. And then he says they pray in all Belashon Ashkenaz, they pray in German. And he says, how could they do this? How could they possibly do this? I'm just skipping down a little bit here. These are excerpts of the tshuva. First of all, he says, for thousands of years, no one's challenged these tefillos. And now they're coming along, and these, he calls them shualim ketanim, these small foxes that he says are choshchei hagolos, are darkened by the exile, that are coming along and changing our nusach tefillah. He says, maybe you'll say, we don't have to pray for the redemption, for the coming of the Messiah, of the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash any longer, because maybe that will be like a claim against us. It'll be like dual loyalty. You're not really a citizen of Hungary or of Hamburg if you are, yearning for a messianic era, yearning to return to your homeland. He says that doesn't make any sense. He says they too. Give me a sec. They also pray for the return of their Messiah. I'm just trying to find where it is. He says, Gam heim me'achalim linchol ir kivaros meshicham. They also hope to inherit the city of their Messiah's grave, which means Jesus, right? They're also praying for another time when they would be able to find redemption. That's not considered a problem. And he says, you're afraid we're going to insult them? You're afraid that we're going to make some sort of issue with the non-Jews? He says, you're the ones who are insulting them. He says, those who are saying, Kamonu kimochem, we're just like you, you're the one throwing thorns in their eyes. Why? Because you're bringing a non-Jew, a Christian person, to play music in our synagogue for a faith that he doesn't even believe in. That's insulting to him. He says, what are you going to say? He just doesn't really know better. He's just like, he says, he's a Maisa Kof. He's like a monkey. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really know what's going on. He says that's insulting to him that he doesn't recognize what's going on. He doesn't have, yes, it's a job, but that's a very demeaning job. Imagine if you were to flip it around, that you have this Jew who's helping the Christians with their service. It's not going to create goodwill. And then he says, oh, you're worried about the rank and file, people not knowing how to daven, and they don't know Hebrew. He says, they should go ahead and learn Hebrew, right? Learn Hebrew instead of changing all of the Nesachat Tefillah. He doesn't actually, he has many, many arguments quoting from different sources and different texts. He doesn't quote from HaChadash Aser Min HaTorah in this particular tshuva. That we have to wait till a different tshuva in 1830. 1830, there was a question that was asked to the Chasam Sofer about a bima that was being moved. This type of, the reading of the Torah was read on a bima, and they wanted to move it to the front. It was probably because that's how it was in the churches in that area. And he responds very strongly. I'm not going to go into all of his arguments, but he bases himself on Gemaras and he's discussing a Rambam. And basically, he does quote, amongst other arguments, this idea of a chadash aser min haTorah. Okay, I want to just hachadash aser min haTorah, which means any of these innovations are prohibited. I want to read just a quick analysis of this from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in source number 10. So he says that I don't agree with everything the way he's formulates it here, but I think it's a good summary. He says the ultra-conservative position was in fact a radical extension of halacha. It was especially carried through to the synagogue, right? He was very sensitive to that moving things in the synagogue, the choirs, etc. I'm skipping down to the next paragraph. The underlying logic of this approach to Jewish law was that anything which in itself is permitted, but which has become a symbol of religious disintegration, is ipso facto turned into something which is forbidden. If halacha was to exercise its role as a vehicle of Jewish continuity, it must erect new fences to replace those that had broken down. It must preserve the past for the sake of the future, even in respect of the details of the past which had not previously been endowed with religious significance. Right, so you have to put up walls. You have to define who you are, and say that what you're not. That's by definition a new response to modernity. It's a new movement, and this I think you can find sort of the root and the beginnings of it in the Chasam Sofer. Okay, there's a really important correspondence that I don't want to skip over, but I'm just going to have to summarize it because I want to get to also North America. So. Maybe we'll just wait for the questions at the end. Is that okay? So, there's a correspondence between Rav Tzvi Hirsch Chios, the Maratz Chios, or Maratz Tzvi Hirsch Chios, depending on how you pronounce it. He has a correspondence with Rav Moshe Sofer, and there's a series of letters that go back and forth between them. And this question of Chadash Aser Min HaTorah comes up again, and there's a discussion about, you guessed it, delaying the burial. And he gives a little bit of an explanation. Rav Moshe Sofer writes to Rav Tzvi Chios, who was a little bit more accommodating and more understanding of the world in which, I guess, the modern world they were living in. It's a very interesting character. Rav Hutner's daughter, Bruria Hutner, in 1973, wrote a PhD dissertation at Columbia on him, and she entitled it Traditionalist and Maskil, which we think of the two as, paradoxical. But he was respected by all, and also more, I guess, open to accommodation than Chasam Sofer was. So the Chasam Sofer writes this in source number 10. He says, I wrote to you, and I want to clarify something that I wrote to you about this idea of a chadash aser min haTorah. He says, Lo kosafti orla v'kilayim v'pigo lo yeratzeh. I didn't mention the other things that are prohibited. Kiyama chadash, I mentioned chadash, which is the new grain, for a particular reason. Ki mizikenim esponim, because I look back to my elders. Sheroy lios mimikime haTorah, the people who upheld the Torah. V'nizharu miliftoach pesach, they were very careful to open up ulechapes kulos l'pritzi amenu, to give leniencies to those who are reaching and acting licentiously. Asher osam mavakshim, that the kulos that they wanted. Im yimtzu sadakim achad shel sidkit, right? If they find a small hole, yifritzu peretz al pnei peretz. They're going to open, in other words, a small. You give them an inch, they're going to want a mile. And then he says something fascinating. He says, you want to argue that you can delay the burial because based on a Chavos Yair. The Chavos Yair said, Halanas Ames is only the Rabbanan. He says, Ein Megalin Hadavar. Don't tell people this. Don't tell people about this Chavos Yair. He says, my approach is, sometimes you have to be Maleh HaIsser. He says you have to pump up the fact that it's forbidden. And that's why I said it's a double Isser. It's an Isser Aseh and an Isser Lo Aseh. It's a negative commandment. It's a positive commandment. He says, what does it matter? It's not really a nafkamina. There's no real difference whether it's D'Rabbanan or D'Oraisa. You can't do it at the end of the day. He says, because people think, I'll accept there was divine revelation. I'll accept that, God doesn't want me. But the rabbis? What rabbis? Well, the rabbis made it up. I don't care about what those rabbis say. So he says, therefore, don't tell people that this is a rabbinic thing. You see what he's doing. You see there's sort of an awareness of the policy and sort of the awareness of where this is coming from. Where is this question coming from? Is this a legitimate question? If it's not, then we have to nip it in the bud. And then he says, he quotes. Okay, we can't go into all the debates over. Okay. Interestingly enough, Rav Moshe Feinstein, when he was asked this question about 100 years later, you could look at source number 11. He says this whole business. I've heard people say you can't have a bima moved up to the front. He says, maybe it's true, but if it's architecturally more important or it's feasible, that maybe it's good to accommodate the chasam sofer if we have to. But at the end of the day, he says it was a hara shah. It was a specific battle with the reform. It's not relevant to us anymore today, and it's totally legitimate. Okay, at this point, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what this means for, I guess you could call it, these different movements, and what I would call, maybe using Rabbi Sachs' term, the consequences of secession. So secession, or Ostrad, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Rav Hirsch really talks a lot about this idea of seceding from the community, of the larger community of let's say, general Jewish community, and following only these more elite, select group of people, of having an independent community. But you see this also in the writings of the Chasam Sofer. And something that Rabbi Sachs points out, which is that both Rav Hirsch and the Chasam Sofer, they're models of sort of drawing the lines and saying, this is them and this is us. We don't do this. We don't move the bima. We don't change the tefillos. We're totally traditional. We don't change anything. He says that that's actually sort of using the same methodologies that Mendelssohn himself used, which is interesting because Mendelssohn was one of the first to argue that religion should be in the private sphere. It should not be in the public. It should be your own personal religious conscience. And this was one of the things that he talks about in his writings and in Jerusalem, that religion can't be coerced. So it's interesting that I think Rabbi Sachs overstates the point a bit, but the point that religion then moved from the public sphere of a community that was just sort of what you did, and then moved into the private sphere, I think is a very important point, because now in the modern era, as I mentioned, this is a trend. This is not one particular movement. Everyone's affected by modernity. But in modernity, whatever choices you make as an individual is how you're going to practice. So therefore, if you choose to be traditional, that's your choice. If you choose to be reform, if you choose to be conservative, that is your personal choice. It was never that case before. And therefore, secession, he sort of blames it on the Chasam Sofer and Rav Hirsch. I don't think secession, sort of moving to the private sphere or separating from the community is necessarily the fault of any one of is it the fault of the traditionalists? I don't think so. I think by definition, I would posit, by definition, when it's your own personal choice, there's going to be fraction. There's going to be fractures and there's going to be different factions. He writes as follows, this is in source number 13, accommodation generally leads to pluralism and denomination. Resistance leads, so Peter Berger has argued, to sectarian forms of religious organization. Right? But I think sectarianism, moving into different sects, I believe, is an inevitable result of modernity. Because now it's our choice. Because now we are going to find like-minded individuals who have also made that choice. There will then be a breakdown in sectarianism. And now we can all choose in our own private decision how we're going to practice. And that, I think, is an important point, that he wants to argue that we should distinguish between ideology and organization. And we shouldn't think that Judaism ideologically embraces sectarianism. I think that's obvious. I don't think you need to argue that point. But it may become aware of this idea that we're really one people. We really begin as one people in the story of the Torah, and the fact that we have Orthodox, modern Orthodox, Haredi, Chardal, religious Zionists, this Messianic religion, all these sectarianist, Reform, conservative. That's all a response to modernity. It's not. I think it's a. He wants to say he sort of says it's about the militant, sectarian extremists, which sort of brought about this point. But I think it's an inevitable response to modernity. Even if your response to modernity is accommodation, that's also you're becoming a sort of sect, because you're going to be different than somebody else's reaction to the opportunities of modernity. I realize we're going to have a part 2 on this one. Yes.
I accept that in 2025, looking through the prism, that's true. I'm really struggling with the original, because I think the original had maybe I'm just still stuck in the old school.
Yeah.
And I'm not, you see that in the Chassam Sofer's writings, how he felt that they were breaching the walls, and subsequently, in Shuvas later on, that there was really they had by design a different intention. There wasn't just sectarianism in it. They were much stronger or more orthodox than today's Orthodox.
Meaning, just to understand your question, you're saying the original point that I made, that you're commenting on, what is it? For sure, the Chassam Sofer saw these new movements as the ones to blame. I guess if you want to read sort of writ large and try to take a bird's eye view, he's not battling modernity; he's battling these movements. Right? So, you have to really. I'm utilizing Yehuda Geber's research on this. You'd have to really study the issue, but a lot of these issues that became rallying cries for, let's call it the Orthodox or the Neo-Orthodox, whatever you want to call it, the response to the Reform, they're not issues anymore, because they're not, as Rabbi Sachs pointed out, they didn't have religious significance. They became to have religious significance. The bima's placement, speaking the vernacular, a chuppah inside, outside, right? These things became fault lines. Some of them are today, some of them are not. Historically, again, to accept this narrative, you have to really argue that these movements were so successful that they changed the entire Jewish world in 200 years. The reality is these movements were very small. There was very few people that were part of this reform movement. If anything, it's not even, many historians question whether you can even call it a movement. The Haskalah movement, it was not a large group. But you have to argue they were so successful, they were able to make inroads in Spanish communities of displaced Sephardic Jews who were driven out, who secularized. Yes, you could say there was persecution and therefore they were Moranos, but they didn't have a reform movement. In England, there was no reform movement at all to speak of in the 18th century in England, in the 19th century. And yet, secularization all over the place. North America, there was no strong... The reform in North America, ironically, begins with the rabbinate. The people were immigrants. They just wanted to get a job. And they wanted to assimilate, and it made it impossible to be an Orthodox Jew, not because they subscribed to Moses Mendelssohn's vision in Jerusalem, in his writings. It had nothing to do with him. It was that I need a job on Monday. So the realities of modernity and being an immigrant in a new country where you're destabilized and you're not connected to your past has much more to do. I'm not going to say it has nothing to do with these, but it's a global phenomenon. It's not just happening in Berlin. It's happening in all these communities. If you were to take this if you want to embrace this narrative, you'd have to say that reform was so successful that they impacted like 90% of the entire Jewish world in 200 countries. I see it more, and you see this in the Christian world as well. In the Christian world, there was a real again, I'm not an expert, I'm utilizing Geber's make this point, there was a real secularization and then a resurgence of religious commitment, which was not expected in the Christian world as well, which has a lot to do with sensing a feeling of authenticity and searching for that in the modern world. Yes? Either one.
I've heard talks about Sarah Schneller, how he's revolutionary in creating the Beis Yaakov movement.
Where did you hear that?
Yeah, and the like, and I'm sure
Yes.
they build plays in the schools talking about a reliving and all that. But I wonder if some of the credit should go to Christianity and to the Reform movement for being the impetus to create that.
So it is interesting. We always gain our identity by our enemies, right? In other words, when you have an enemy, it's hard to speak of an enemy as a Jew, but when you have an other, so you can really more embrace your own sense of identity. So yeah, I guess the Reform, we have a lot to thank in certain ways. As we'll see, if anything, I think that Reform, in their mind, which is, I guess, going back to Lesher's point, they didn't want secularization. Their vision was, this is how we're going to survive and going to accommodate and meet modernity in a different way. They had a different strategy. You can argue whether it was successful or not successful. You could argue whether it was anti-Torah or not. But the reality is that you can look at their writings. Their goal was not everyone should become secular. That wasn't their goal. In terms of Sarah Schneer, I mean, a lot of it had to do with just lack of women's education. So I would say...
It was good enough for thousands of years.
But the world changed, right? And women were now not getting what they needed from their Jewish tradition, and they were seen as equals in the workplace, but were given no Jewish education. That's another story entirely. I guess we'll just finish with one reflection. We haven't really gotten into the North American scene, but we'll, I guess, leave that for another part of our series. So, just to begin where we started, to end where we started. So, traditional observance, I think the greatest enemy to traditional observance is not anti-Semitism. It's not other forms of Judaism. It's really it's secularization and assimilation, right? And these things are not easy to combat. Like, how do you combat assimilation? So I think that we would be mistaken if we thought that people not being connected to their Jewish tradition is because of a particular ideology. Really, we should encourage anyone who draws spiritual strength in today's society, in today's world, in 2025, we want to encourage that. We want to understand that we're all reacting to modernity. I happen to believe that Orthodoxy provides the greatest formula for meaning and for Jewish affiliation. But I recognize that it's a certain reaction to the modern world. It works for me. But I think that more than berating other movements, more important to embrace and to give people a way to connect to what gives them spiritual strength, and what gives them energy and what connects them to their people. So that's really what the first part of this, I guess, installment would be. I wanted to get to the other movements, but we don't have enough time. It's supposed to end at 9:00, so we will stop here for now. Thank you, everyone, for coming.